This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Kenan. After he became the father of Kenan, Enosh lived 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Kenan lived 840 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Kenan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. After he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more, because God took him away. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years, and then he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands, caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." After Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and then he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Genesis chapter 5, the genealogy from Adam to Noah. 32 verses, 35 sentences, 498 words filled with unfamiliar and unpronounceable names, all tied together with a seemingly endless string of numbers and years. If you thought that the second half of Genesis 4 was tempting for us to skip over, I will remind you that the text for that particular sermon was a paltry 18 verses consisting only of 230 words. I'm rather reminded of the church whose outdoor sign advertised this, quote, "If you want to know what hell is like, come and listen to this week's sermon." I hope it's not that bad. But anyway, as we know, every chapter of Holy Scripture teaches us something about God, teaches us something about ourselves, and perhaps, as in the case today, may very well teach us something of endurance. Well, we should discuss two introductory matters before we get to the text itself. And the first is the structure of this genealogy. With three exceptions, which we shall consider later, each person is described in identical terms. First, we're told how many years he lived before his son or his heir was born. Next, how many years he lived after his son or his successor was born. And finally, these two figures are added up, and we're told how many years he lived in total before he died. We're also told that each had other sons and daughters, all who are anonymous except for the three sons at the end. Each man's life is described only in relation to his successor. As soon as each son or heir is born, the interest passes to him, and then the father is sort of dismissed in a couple of sentences. It's clear, therefore, that what matters to the chronicler is the unfolding purpose of God from generation to generation. Our second question concerns longevity. The shortest lifespan given to us is that of Enoch, who lived 365 years. Positively young, considering that all but two lived into their 900s, with Methuselah living 969 and therefore taking the top spot, as it were. This means that nearly all of these antediluvian people, those who lived before the flood, antediluvian, that these antediluvian people mentioned here lived 13 to 40 times longer than an average lifespan. Another surprising feature is the advanced age at which these men had children. Noah was 500 years old when he started having kids. However, we need to be cautious about these figures because we know that in different versions that they're not identical. The total period between the creation of Adam and the flood is 1,656 years in the Hebrew text, but 1,307 in the Samaritan Pentateuch. It is 2,242 or 2,262 according to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But whichever figures are correct, we still need to understand them. What do we make of this longevity, of these long lifespans? Three answers have been historically provided for this question. The first is that a year represents only a few months, and therefore the apparent longevity of these men can be reduced to by a quarter or a sixth or even a 12th of the figures given in the text. But on the other hand, there's really no evidence that years were or could be calculated in that manner. Furthermore, such figures create a different sort of problem. It would mean that some of these men were themselves children when their children were born. The second theory is that this genealogy is not complete, nor was it meant to be complete, because various generations are omitted. This is not impossible because other genealogies, both biblical and Babylonian, are known to be abridged. For example, the genealogy of Christ that we see in Matthew's gospel is known to be incomplete. And Matthew does so in a deliberately stylized way, giving 3 periods of 14 generations. Since the genealogy here in Genesis 5 before the flood, and then that in Genesis 11 after the flood, both have 10 generations, it's possible that the chronicler stylized them as well. The third alternative is to accept the chronology as it reads. And this too is not impossible, nor is it altogether inconsistent with the theory that there are gaps in the genealogy. We know in ancient non-biblical works from Egypt and Babylon that long lives were a common characteristic of mankind. And this may also account for the rapid growth in population. But of course we ask, well, how is it possible for such longevity? Well, according to the biblical narrative itself, this may have something to do with the flood. The only people who are said to have lived such vast existences were those who lived before the flood. After the flood, we start to see a steep and steady decline in lifespans. Thus, Noah, we're told, died when he was 950, but his son Shem was 600. And Shem's son, his grandson, and great-grandson all died in their 400s, while the next 3 generations died in their 200s. By the time we get to Joseph, we read he died when he was only 110. Thus, in 13 post-Diluvian generations from Noah to Joseph, man's lifespan fell steadily from 950 to 110. How do we account for this? Well, I understand that even today, the precise causes of aging are not fully understood, but radiation is known to have damaging genetic effects on humans, and if not lethal, it may at least reduce our lifespan. If the so-called canopy theory is true, that before the flood, the Earth was entirely enclosed in an envelope of water vapor, as Venus still is today, then those who lived before the flood were protected from the deleterious effects of radiation. And this water vapor dissipated or was dispersed at the time of the flood in the deluge. And then, of course, mankind was now exposed to ultraviolet radiation in a way that previous generations had not been. Now, this is only a theory, but it's at least a possible theory. But as we pointed out in the creation story, the Bible was not written to teach science. It was written to teach wisdom and how to live according to the will of God. We come now to the genealogy itself. And as one reads this, we notice immediately that the monotony, the dreary monotony of this genealogy is interrupted only 3 times. We see this at the beginning in reference to Adam and Seth, verses 1 through 5. Then in the middle in reference to Enoch, verses 21 to 24. And then finally at the end, verses 28 to 31, when we're introduced to Noah. First then, Adam and Seth, verses 1 through 5. Let me read the first 3 verses of this chapter. This is the written account of Adam's family line. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them, and he named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. The essential truths of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 about God's creation of man are recalled here. First, that God made him in the likeness of God. Second, that he created them male and female. Third, that he blessed them, that is, he gave them reproductive powers. And fourthly, that God named them mankind because they were taken from the earth, the Hebrew word for man and soil being very similar. However, the specific importance of this paragraph is that the creation of Adam and the birth of Seth are related to one another. In verse 1, we're told that God created Adam in the likeness of God. In verse 3, Adam is said to have fathered Seth in Adam's own likeness. The Hebrew word for likeness is the same in both sentences. And so how are they related? Is it that Adam's likeness to God and Seth's likeness to Adam are the same, or are they different? I suspect that the only possible answer is both. So first we might say that this likeness is the same. God created Adam in the likeness of God. Adam then imparted God's likeness to Seth. This divine image or divine likeness in which Adam and Eve were created was now transmitted to their children. And so from generation to generation, this divine likeness has been translated or transmitted to us. Although our origin is different from that of our first parents in that we are begotten, not made, we're procreated, not created, yet we too, like Seth, bear the image of God. We see this in the New Testament. In James chapter 3, we're told that even sinful people like ourselves are made in God's likeness. But secondly, we might say that this likeness is different. It's different because Adam and Eve, who became the parents of Seth, were not the same when God had created them. They were now fallen creatures. As a result of their disobedience and God's judgment upon their disobedience, the glory of the divine image had become tarnished, its purity soiled, its perfection defaced. Their mind now darkened, their heart corrupt, their conscience twisted, their will enslaved, their soul estranged from God. It is therefore this distorted divine image in which Adam and Eve transmitted to Seth as well. And this is confirmed by the grim refrain which comes at the end of each paragraph in this chapter. It's like the tolling of a funeral bell. And then he died. And then he died. And then he died. God made death the penalty for sin. And so it has been ever since. Every child born into this world is made in the image of God and born into sin. This is the paradox of humanity. We possess both the image of God and the grotesque marks of rebellion. We are alienated and estranged from God, and yet at the same time, we recognize that lostness. We can sense that the world is not how it should be, that we're destined for so much more. Now let us jump to verses 21 through 24, to Enoch. You will remember from Genesis chapter 4 that Enoch was the son of the murderous Cain. In fact, Cain named the first city after his son, Enoch. Although the name is exactly the same, the Enoch we read about in this chapter, in chapter 5, is an altogether different person than Cain's Enoch. This Enoch comes from the lineage of Seth. And in a surprisingly unpretentious and almost imperceptible way, again, the genealogical monotony is broken. So far, the pattern has been this person lived this many years after he gave birth to a son, that he had other sons and daughters, and then in due time, he died. It's only with Enoch we see not that he lived, but that he walked faithfully with God. And not that he died, but then he was no more because God took him away. No doubt, like the rest of his ancestors, Enoch also had other sons and daughters. But even in this ordinary environment of home and family, he lived an extraordinary life. Both his life and his death were different from those of any other man. I mean, his life. Life for Enoch was so much more than a physical or a social existence. Twice, it's written in verses 22 and 24, that he walked faithfully with God. How did this walk begin? Well, we're never told. The prophet Amos, he asks this question in chapter 3, verse 3. Do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so? And what that means is that some sort of reconciliation must have taken place. Thus, we may assume that at some point, perhaps at the birth of Methuselah, Enoch sought forgiveness and he found it. Now reconciled with God, Enoch began to walk faithfully with God. In fact, he became the first of a glorious succession of godly men and women, like Noah, his great-grandson, who also walked with God. Like Abraham, who was called a friend of God. Like Moses, who spoke to God face to face. Enoch enjoyed a communion with God which was deep and personal and intimate and rich. And such a walk with God implies several things. The first thing it implies is faith. Faith is the quality singled out by the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. This is Hebrews chapter 11, verses 5 and 6. I just want to read this for you. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. The logic of this is plain. Enoch couldn't have drawn near to God or walked with God if he did not believe in God, recognizing by faith God's existence and God's presence and God's promises. Perhaps you will recall Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, where the Lord God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. It seems probable that Adam and Eve were granted a visible manifestation of God's presence. But here in the text, there's no hint to suggest that such a privilege was granted to Enoch. It seems that Enoch walked by faith, not by sight, as we too are called to walk. If the first thing implied in this walk with God is faith, then the second is holiness. For God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. And if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and we do not live out the truth. The only way to walk faithfully with God is to walk in the light, turning from the dark alleys and the bypaths of sin. We've alluded to chapter 6, where we read that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. We may conclude the same with Enoch. If Enoch walked faithfully with God, he too must have been a righteous and a blameless man. Indeed, by the grace of God, like Noah, Enoch maintained a life of purity and godliness. A life of purity and godliness amid the wickedness of his generation. He lived a godly life in the midst of ungodliness. And so this walk with God requires faith. It requires holiness. And the third thing we see with Enoch is perseverance. Notice that Enoch didn't run with God as if it were some sort of divine race. No, Enoch walked with God. His closeness, his fellowship with God was not melodramatic. It was not an emotional phase he was going through. No, this was a steady, unremitting walk. And I don't even think the word walk is always the best way to think about it. I'm thinking about this faithful walk of Enoch's was sometimes a slog, plodding along through the years. He went for a long, long slog with God, which lasted 300 years. And this requires stamina and determination, faith and perseverance. And I have no doubt there were times where Enoch got tired and he was tempted to fall out or to give up, but he slogged on until he got his second wind. We all know those words from Isaiah chapter 40, that God gives strength to the weary, power to the weak, that those who trust in the Lord will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary, walk and not grow faint. Words we live by as Christians for sure, but easier said than done. Walking with God in faith and holiness, with perseverance, it's a slog. I don't think it's easy for any of us. So that's the life of Enoch. Now let's talk about his death. Verse 24. Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more, because God took him away. This is to say that Enoch disappeared. I suppose that one day his family and friends, they noticed that he wasn't around. He was nowhere to be found. Of course, they searched for him, but they couldn't find him anywhere. And they drew the only possible conclusion, that God had taken him. Again, Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He was gone without sickness, without dying, without burial. Now, in our modern skepticism, we find this extremely difficult to grasp, but in all actuality, it's not that difficult if we look to what we've been studying so far in Genesis. Enoch being taken directly by God, what we would call the process of translation, was God's original intent for mankind before we rebelled and were sentenced to die. We were to be on earth for a period of time, and then God would glorify the body without the necessity of death or resurrection. It's what will happen to the last generation, the survivors when Christ comes again, who will not sleep, but will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. It's what Jesus Christ could have enjoyed at the transfiguration if he had not willed in love to return to earth and die. It's what both Enoch and Elijah experienced. So how is this applicable for us today? Well, unless Christ returns during our lifetime, then the answer is really not applicable, at least not literally. But symbolically, that phrase, God took him away. God took him away. It's a beautiful depiction of Christian death. As a matter of fact, the same Hebrew verb used for death, this idea of taking us, we see at least twice in the Psalms. For example, Psalm 49, but God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. Psalm 73, verse 24, you guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will take me into glory. He will take us. He will receive us. And this is how Christians ought to think about death. It's not that we die, but that God takes us. Not that we depart into the ether or to some unknown destination, but that God receives us unto himself. It's why as Christians we are forever echoing the words of St. Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain, since it brings our fellowship with Jesus Christ to its proper consummation. In our times of deep sorrow and despair and unadulterated bereavement, to remember only the phrase, then he was no more, If we just took that and then he was no more, that will magnify our grief and it will absorb us in our loss. But that isn't the end, is it? No, because God took him away. Enoch was no more because God took him away. And that, my friends, is where we find comfort in loss. And where, far from being absorbed in our own bereavement and sadness, we are once again absorbed. We're drawn in to those who mourn with us. The third and the final break in the genealogy is at the end, verses 28 and 29, with Lamech and Noah. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." Now you will recall Lamech from the previous chapter, that vicious and violent man. Well, again, this is a different person. This is a different Lamech. The earlier Lamech was a sixth-generation descendant of Cain, but the Lamech we meet here, Noah's father, was an eighth-generation descendant of Adam through his son Seth. In Lamech, his prophecy refers to God's curse upon the ground because of man's sin. You'll recall now it was chapter 3, our labor will involve sweat and toil. And Lamech prophesies that through Noah, some comfort, some alleviation will be granted to mankind. It's not at all likely that this comforter Lamech refers to is the promised deliverer who would crush the serpent's head, but he does predict that in the midst of the curse, there would be blessings, that in the midst of work, comfort, that in the midst of toil, relief. And Noah thus became a kind of greater salvation to which Jesus and the Apostle Peter refer to. And with Noah, God established his everlasting covenant. Now that we have looked at these three breaks in genealogy, we need to conclude with their application. The first thing we might say about Genesis 5 is that God is the God of history. As generation follows generation, as the years, decades, centuries, millennia, as they roll by, God's people have always been able to say the words of Psalm 90, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God." God is the God of Adam, Seth, Enoch, Lamech, and Noah. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of Moses and of the prophets, of Jesus Christ and the apostles. And God is working today as year succeeds year. Oftentimes we look at the situation of this world, the confusion, the godlessness, the lies, the institutions that we once trusted so dearly have been in many cases overrun by duplicity and dishonesty, wolves in sheep's clothing, false teacher that the Bible warns us about, leading people astray. And so we become depressed and downcast. Our faith wavers. We wonder if God has forgotten about us or even forsaken us. But then we survey the arc of history. We remember God's purpose in creation. We remember his covenant with his people. And we know that his cause will triumph in the end. God is the God of history. The second thing we might say about this chapter is that God always guides his people. True, there are those who reject and deny him, fools, as the Bible calls them, who say in their heart there is no God. But even in the darkest hour, there are those who shine like stars in the sky. Godly men and women in the midst of ungodliness. And ever since the fall of man, there has been this double line, the ungodly line of Cain and the godly line of Seth. Sometimes they seem very familiar. They look, dress, talk, they behave in much the same way. They even bear the same names. They may have the same names but possess a very different nature, walk a very different path, reap a very different destiny. As the purpose of God unfolds itself in history, men and women arrange themselves either on the side of Cain and his descendants or Seth and his descendants. In the coming year, we as a church must face a decision whether or not to remain the United Methodist Church or follow another line. Will our church be sown in the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent? Will we be like Cain, who said there is no God, where we try to make God in our own imagination? Will we be a church who worships the one true God only on our terms, only if it fits our modern sensibilities? Or will we be like Abel, recognizing that God is the owner and the author of life? Do we belong in the worldliness of Cain's family or in the godly line of Seth's family? Cain and Seth each have their Enoch and Lamech. And Cain's Enoch gave his name to the city which his father had built in defiance of God, while Seth's Enoch walked faithfully with God. Cain's Lamech uttered a curse and a boastful, vengeful war song. Seth's Lamech uttered a prophecy, promising relief from toil and deliverance from the curse. No matter what decision is made, the United Methodist Church, this local church, will never be the same again. And perhaps that's good. In the words of John Henry Newman, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. But that is why, as a church, as Christians, we must be in prayer. And while in prayer, we must be asking God to grant us discernment to recognize the righteous from the unrighteous, the Cains from the Seths. Because you see, the issues that we face today are complex. They're subtle. They're very nuanced. But let us remember what the very first question in human history was. This question uttered by the serpent has been and continues to be asked of every person in every generation. Did God really say? Suddenly the woman does not know anymore. You see, in Eve's mind, a shadow is beginning to fall. Whose word should she listen to? Who could she trust? Did God really say? It's a question of doubt, a question that sows the seed of doubt. The two great lines in humanity, that unspoken question of the human race. Who are we? Who are we as a church? There's no neutral ground, so where do we belong? Is it in the worldliness of Cain's family, or is it in the godly line of Seth's family? And it is my prayer that God leads us all into that godly family, which is his will for all of mankind. Amen.